What sort of advice would you give to those people if they had time to try their hand at painting?
Well, anybody can paint that wants to paint.
Can they?
Oh, sure. Sure, anybody can paint.
The art world, for all its supposed embrace of creativity, has long been a closed system. Its gates held firmly by the well-born, the well-connected, and the formally trained. This world, much like other cultural institutions, has been controlled by influential figures, whether it be wealthy patrons, the royalty, or members of the church. This meant that those on the outside, the women, the people of color, those with lower socioeconomic statuses, and even older artists, were rarely given entry. Their art, if seen at all, was frequently overlooked, misattributed, or treated as a joke. Even the locations artists lived in had an impact on their success. Being in the right place at the right time was often crucial. To be in Florence in the 15th century during the Renaissance, or Paris in late 19th century during the Belle Époque, or New York from the 1940s onwards with abstract expressionism and pop art, meant being at the heart of artistic innovation. Those who lived in major cultural centers had more opportunities to exhibit their work, meet clients, and get their names out there. And yet, what of those who were not at the center of these cultural upheavals? The ones who painted not for fame, but for themselves. Deemed outsider art, a term coined by critic Roger Cardinal in 1972, to describe a diverse cast of creators, this group encompasses similar-sounding names you may be familiar with, including self-taught, folk, naive, or intuitive art, and art brut. For one's work to be considered outsider art, an artist must be operating outside of any formal education or institution, whether by choice or due to circumstances beyond their control. These artists didn't set out to join a movement or make a mark on the art world. They were simply people, driven by an unshakable need to create, whether to understand their place in the world or to navigate its chaos. Most didn't even see themselves as artists or recognize their works as art, but that's exactly what their creations were, their innermost desires flowing from their hands onto a surface. Outsider art, which has now found itself headlining major exhibitions, does something that the neatly curated galleries often fail to. It confronts us with what we've chosen to ignore. The untrained and the unseen laid bare. And perhaps that's why it resonates. It forces us to reconsider not just what art is, but who gets to make it and why. In the 10 works we're about to explore, what emerges isn't just a different way of seeing art, but a broader, more generous view of what creativity can be. Today's video is sponsored by Craftsy. Craftsy is an online community offering over 2,000 classes across a wide range of creative disciplines. I personally have recently gotten into learning more and practicing watercolor paintings. But Craftsy isn't just about visual art. They've got classes on quilting, photography, baking, and so much more. And beyond the lessons, you get to connect with this vibrant community of fellow creators, share your progress, swap ideas, and keep that inspiration flowing. The first 1,000 of you to click on the link in the video description will get a full year of premium membership to Craftsy for only $1.49, valid for new members only. That's unlimited access to all other classes for less than the cost of a coffee. If outsider art teaches us anything, it's that creativity is all about experimenting and finding your own voice. And Craftsy is a fantastic way to get started. Now let's dive back into the video. Henri Rousseau, born in Laval, France in 1844, is perhaps the most famous artist placed in the category of naive art. This style of art is done with childlike simplicity, often by someone lacking formal training, and hence ignoring all traditional rules of perspective. Rousseau grew up in a family that regularly grappled with financial instability, which put him to work at a young age as a tinsmith at his father's workshop. And so he did not have the formal education and artistic training that many of his contemporaries enjoyed. but he began to teach himself how to paint in his early 40s and retired in 1893 at the age of 49 to pursue his art full-time. He is referred to as le douanier, or customs officer, from the job he held previous to his painting career. He was a self-taught artist and claimed he had no teacher other than nature. The most academic guidance he had came from advice that was given to him by established painters like Félix-Auguste Clément and Jean-Léon Gérôme. His paintings, characterized by flat compositions and bright, almost childlike use of color, were often met with ridicule. This, in combination with his lack of traditional training, made it difficult for Rousseau to gain acceptance in the conservative French art world. He painted traditional genres such as portraits, landscapes, allegories, and exotic scenes. But his lack of familiarity with the boundaries of what was deemed correct made his pieces more interesting. He found inspiration from illustrated magazines, adventure novels, postcards, and photographs, which lent his pieces with a graphic quality that was shocking. Rather than debating whether his art was high or lowbrow, viewers were instead drawn to the authenticity of his creations. Best known for his paintings of jungles, Rousseau's scenes are recognizable by their dense compositions and vibrant color palettes depicting lush, teeming wilderness filled with exotic plants and animals. What is particularly remarkable about these works is that Rousseau never traveled beyond the borders of France. These are not based on his first-hand experience, but rather from his imagination, inspired by illustrations from children's books and his visits to the botanical gardens in Paris. A counterpoint to the familiar Paris he lived in, these images of seductive and terrifying faraway places reflected the desires and fears of a new modern world. The Dream, completed in 1910 and measuring at 2 by 3 meters, exemplifies the surreal qualities that define much of Rousseau's later work. This piece is one of the 25 jungle scenes he completed in his lifetime, possibly being his last, and was exhibited to the public just a few months before his death. In it, a nude woman is reclining under the moonlight on a red sofa that appears to have been plucked out of a Parisian apartment. Her body is turned towards us, but her gaze looks to the right side of the painting, leading us to discover the landscape. We see a lush jungle filled with flora and fauna, including birds, monkeys, an elephant, a lion and a lioness, and a snake. The positions in which the bird here and the snake at the bottom of the canvas are painted resemble our main subjects, bringing harmony to the flow of lines. Her left arm reaches towards the lions and a snake charmer who faces the viewer playing his flute, barely visible in the gloom of the jungle under the dim light of the full moon. The color palette is rich in greens and blues, punctuated by touches of vibrant hues, such as the snake charmer's clothing, the yellows of the bird's feathers, the orange of the fruits and the snake, and the soft pinks of the lotus flowers. This painting doesn't explicitly hint at a narrative, but that's precisely the point. Rousseau wasn't interested in telling a straightforward story. He was creating a world within which the boundaries between reality and imagination are blurred, or rather a scene from a dream. His work was unfortunately misunderstood during his lifetime. His unschooled art was beyond the comprehension of the conservative academics who juried the annual salons and excluded him. But luckily, the Société des Artistes Indépendants began its annual unjuried salons in 1884. They were open to all artists, regardless of their background or style, and Rousseau exhibited his work there almost every year until his death in 1910. Over time, his unconventional approach to painting earned him the respect and admiration of influential figures in the art world, including Guillaume Apollinaire, Robert Delaunay, and Pablo Picasso. Today, Rousseau is celebrated as a pioneer of naive art. His works have endured not for the seal of academic approval granted after his passing, but because he taps into a primal and universal sense of wonder that lives in us all. Alfred Wallis, a British fisherman turned artist, was renowned for his port landscapes and shipping scenes, painted in a naive style. He worked as a deep-sea fisherman early in his life, both locally and across the North Atlantic, but upon moving to St. Ives, a seaside town in Cornwall, England in 1890, he established himself as a marine store dealer, trading in scrap iron, sails, and rope. When his wife passed away in 1922, he took up painting at the age of 70 for a company. He was a self-taught artist and used household paint on scraps of cardboard. Shopkeepers in his neighborhood would even save him old grocery boxes and crates to paint on, and he never tried to hide this. He left parts of his boxes showing through his works and kept the odd shapes of the boards so that their previous purposes can be seen. His artistic output was prolific. He created hundreds of small pictures in the almost 20 years he painted before passing away in his late 80s in a workhouse. Wallis's pieces are an excellent way of understanding naive art, as rules around perspective are often ignored. The scale of the objects in his scenes were prioritized based on emotional significance rather than their actual size. He is particularly recognized for his seascapes, which were often rendered from memory and frequently depicted sailboats, a subject he knew all too well. During Wallis's lifetime, they were being replaced by steamships, a new and modern invention at the time, and his paintings reflected this shift. This painting, the Hold House Port Mear Square Island Port Mear Beach, perfectly showcases Wallis's distinctive hand. We see a coastal landscape with 10 houses and a boat in the distance. This small piece, measuring at 53.5 by 64 centimeters, is done in Wallis's classic bird's-eye view vantage point. This technique flattens the space and makes the elements appear stacked rather than receding into the distance, giving the painting a map-like quality. The house here and the promontory, a raised mass of land like a cliff that stretches out into a body of water, are painted larger than the rest. In this way, Wallis has created a focal point within the painting, ensuring that we notice and contemplate the house and the promontory before exploring the rest of the scene. The details avoid realism for basic representation and evoke a sense of familiarity and comfort, like of a shared memory between him and the viewer. This work was painted on the reverse of an advertisement for the St. Ives Society of Artists exhibition. The color palette is fairly light, with the pale blues of the water, the ground, and the houses dominating the scene, contrasted only by the rich green of the promontory. Through this piece, Wallis not only captured the physical landscape, but also has influenced a broad array of artists with his unique perspective on scale and material usage, highlighting the authentic power of art to connect and inspire. In 1928, artists Ben Nicholson and Christopher Wood came to the town of St. Ives and established an artist colony. There, they saw in Wallis's raw depictions not just paintings, but visceral events frozen in color. Their recognition brought Wallis into the circle of progressive artists in Britain during the 1930s. It expanded his influence and embedded him within a broader artistic discourse. Yet despite the popularity of his paintings, he did not sell many works during his lifetime, but they did have a lasting impact on modern art, proving that barriers to creating art are more fragile than we often think. Louis Vivin, born in Adolphe, France, is perhaps best known for his charming and humble depictions of Parisian cityscapes, still lifes, and rural scenes. He spent much of his life working as a postal clerk, similar to Henri Rousseau, which left his passion for painting to be explored only in his spare time. His role allowed him to create a series of detailed maps pinpointing the locations of each post office in every postal district of France. This project eventually came to the attention of his leaders, who decided to print it. This earned him not only artistic recognition, but also 2 years of seniority, meaning he received credit for 2 additional years of service, improving his benefits, salary, and retirement. He was also promoted to inspector and was awarded the prestigious Palms Academic Ribbon. However, due to cost considerations, the postal authorities ultimately decided against printing the maps. Wanting to immerse himself in the cultural hub of France, Vivin and his wife moved to the Montmartre region in Paris, which has long been associated with artists and bohemians, in 1889. There he visited the Louvre and the Musée de Luxembourg any chance he got, and found inspiration in the works of Camille Corot, Gustave Courbet, and his favorite, Ernest Meissonier. It's even been said that Vivin had a dream in which Meissonier appeared to him and told him that he could be a great artist if he tried. It wasn't until his retirement in 1923 that he fully devoted himself to painting. Yet even then, his works retained the humility and directness that marked his earlier pieces. His compositions, similar to the other naive artists we've seen, are distinguished by their flatness and a disregard for traditional perspective. Unique to Vivin, however, there's a focus on details that imbues these everyday scenes with a quiet reverence. His choice of subjects are often still lifes, hunting scenes, and views of Paris, and they are noted for their meticulous detail, slightly off-kilter perspective, and resonating feelings of melancholy. We can see that here in Quai aux Fleurs, or Flower Quay. It's a peaceful scene of a flower market along the Seine River in Paris. We see people walking on the road, along the bridge, and within the flower market. Others are standing in the boat that's gently flowing down the river. They are all going about their day, which creates a sense of movement and brings life to the scene. None of the 36 figures have any discerning qualities to resemble an actual person. They are shapes that suggest people rather than define them. We can even see the lines of the surrounding architecture going through them. More than half of the canvas is covered with buildings lining the street, not rendered to be realistic, but rather as a personal interpretation. They seem slightly wobbly and have a childlike quality to them, with the windows and doors placed more frequently than realistic. Beneath these buildings, the Seine, running parallel to the street, reflects the blue of the sky. The water is smooth and clear, almost like a glass, catching the soft light of the day. In the foreground, the flowers in their pots are painted with bright colors, some blossoms standing tall, others spilling over, each contributing to the cheerful yet calm atmosphere. This piece, though simple in execution, carries a deep-rooted sense of nostalgia. He presents to us a world that is out of sync with reality, and since he frequently painted from memory, his pieces are created with some degree of longing and loss. A moment gone, but now lingering palpably in this frame. After all, memories are tinged with the inevitable sense of longing that comes with remembering something cherished but distant. Niko Pirosmani is widely regarded as a self-taught genius and is one of modern art's most enigmatic loners. He was born in 1862 in the small Georgian village of Mirzani. His family were farmers who managed a modest vineyard and raised livestock. Tragically, both of his parents passed away when Niko was only 8 years old, leaving him to be raised by his two older sisters. They decided to move to Tbilisi, the capital city of Georgia, and settled near a railway station. During this period, the young Niko worked as a servant in wealthy households, where he learned to read and write in both Russian and Georgian. After only 6 years, he returned to his village and found work as a herdsman, beginning a precarious life that teetered on the edge of poverty. He went through a series of odd jobs and half-careers, painting houses, creating signboards for shop owners, working as a cook and a railroad conductor, and eventually co-founding a dairy farm. The success of this last venture allowed him to build a house for one of his sisters in Mirzani. Through all of this, Niko was teaching himself to paint. One of his specialties was painting directly onto black oilcloth, an industrial material unheard of among other painters. His use of solid colors, frontal compositions, and simplified forms were a stark departure from the realism that dominated the art world at the time. He painted scenes and subjects that reflected the everyday life and cultural heritage of Georgia. Merchants, tradesmen, laborers, and even some prominent Georgian noblemen. Yet today he is more commonly known for his delightful animal scenes. In fact, he is regarded as the only Georgian artist of his time who specialized in this genre. He created around 200 paintings collectively, yet his focus often remained on survival rather than artistic recognition. Due to a combination of financial challenges he couldn't overcome and his growing struggle with alcoholism, he eventually backed out of the dairy farm that provided him with a stable income. And as his personal circumstances deteriorated, his paintings became a form of barter, with simple portraits traded for hot tavern meals. In the painting Giraffe, we see Pirosmani's imagination. The animal is standing tall against what appears to be an evening sky. Despite its title, it doesn't depict a giraffe as we know it. No, its coat is painted in a pattern of black spots on white skin, rather than the familiar tan or orange skin with brown patches. Given that Pirosmani, as a Georgian artist, would have had limited exposure to exotic animals, it is likely that his portrayal was informed more by second-hand descriptions rather than by first-hand observation. The giraffe thus becomes a symbol of the unknown and the mythical, and not a realistic portrayal. Despite these liberties, he does get some parts of the animal right. The giraffe's long neck stretches upwards, approaching the edge of the canvas, while its slightly disproportionate legs add to its towering presence. The animal's face is innocent, almost childlike, with its large, gentle eyes and small pointed ears. The background of the painting is rather bare, a blue sky and a black-yellow ground, devoid of any landscape or vegetation. The giraffe is all alone, perhaps an extension of Pirosmani's own loneliness. The simplicity here does not diminish the piece's impact, and with no distractions, we are forced to confront the animal directly, as if it were a living presence. On March 30th, 1918, the night before Easter Sunday, Pirosmani was found unconscious in the basement of an abandoned house. Though he was taken to a hospital, he passed away soon after from malnutrition and liver failure. As is often the case with visionary artists, his work gained wider recognition only after his death. His influence extended to an etching by Picasso and a biographical film released in 1969, which I strongly recommend. And in 2002, Pirosmani's image was commemorated on the Georgian 1 lari bill. His paintings captured the essence of rural and urban life, customs, and the people of Georgia in a way that is both genuine and deeply connected to the cultural identity of his homeland. Clementine Hunter was an American folk artist from Louisiana, best known for her colorful paintings of the 20th century plantation life in the rural South. Her exact birth date is unknown, but estimated to be around 1886 and 1887, a time when the lingering presence of slavery was still looming in the United States. Born into a Creole family at Hidden Hill Plantation, near Clutreville, Louisiana, Hunter spent much of her life under demanding physical labor and meager living conditions common to farmhands and domestic servants. At age 15, she moved to Melrose Plantation in Natchitoches Parish to work as a cotton picker. She only attended school for 10 days, and so never acquired the ability to read or write, much less painting formally. In the late 1920s, she went from being a field hand to working as a cook and a housekeeper. It was during this period that Melrose Plantation, under the ownership of Henri, was transformed into an artist colony and attracted notable artists and writers, including Alberta Kinsey. This New Orleans artist visited Melrose Plantation in 1939 and left behind some brushes and paint after her visit.
A lady used to come here. They call her Miss Alberta Kinsey from New Orleans. And she'd come paint the magnolias and all them flowers. And when I was cooking, she'd leave all the paint she'd leave, she'd give it to me. And that's what I painted.
and it was then, when she was in her 50s, that she painted her very first artwork on a window shade. Over the next 5 decades, she produced somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 paintings, many of which were initially done at night after she worked all day in the plantation house. She used whatever services she could find, including boards, window shades, and jugs. Her subjects of choice were the people around her, their everyday lives and her community's major moments, portraying weddings, funerals, and baptisms with a deeply personal touch. Her style is marked by bold colors and simplified forms, offering a vivid perspective on the experiences of Black Americans in the early 20th century South. This is evident in Funeral Procession, a scene of a community coming together to mourn and celebrate the life of a loved one. The composition shows 3 lines of figures descending from a church positioned in the upper right corner, its steeple extending beyond the frame, as if symbolically reaching towards the heavens. 2 men are carrying a coffin, and 2 others stand beside an open grave, while the rest of the figures partake in the procession. The scene is carefully arranged. All of the elements are clearly visible, and there are no overlaps. The attendees, with expressionless faces and wide eyes, resembling paper cutouts, can easily be imagined in a different setting altogether. Yet the emotional weight typically associated with funerals is still subtly conveyed. The vibrant colors of the floral arrangements and the coordinated attire of the women, set against a sky of vivid blue and an unusually salmon pink earth, soften the edge of grief in the scene. Hunter transforms a painful memory into something more approachable and manageable, creating a visual form of storytelling that is both accessible and immediately impactful. On the right side of the painting, we can see a C and an H, which Hunter used as her signature since she couldn't write her name. The painting reflects the significance of funeral traditions in Black American communities, particularly in the rural South. These gatherings serve not only as a farewell to the deceased, but also as communal events that reinforce social and familial bonds. After her husband, Emmanuel Hunter, passed away, she started selling her paintings. She took charge of her public image and organized an ongoing paid exhibition at her home with a sign that reads, "Clementine Hunter, artist, 25 cents to look," and it was later increased to 50 cents. This was likely written by one of the other artists at the colony. Despite being celebrated today as a pivotal figure in folk art, she lived most of her life in poverty. In the 1940s, her paintings sold for quarters, but by the time of her death, they were being sold for thousands of dollars. Yet it's important to note that she painted out of passion and often gave her work away without charge. She was the first Black American artist to have a solo exhibition at the New Orleans Museum of Art, and even received an invitation to the White House from President Jimmy Carter. Hunter lived to the age of 101 and continued painting until shortly before her death. Although she gained some recognition in her later years, she chose to remain rooted in Louisiana, working at Melrose Plantation until 1970, when she relocated to a small trailer a few miles away on an unmarked road. Her works are now esteemed not only for their artistic merit, but also as invaluable cultural and historical records. Her paintings offer profound insights into the adversity and resilience of the communities she portrayed, articulated through her singular vision that was shaped by the rough edges of a life lived under difficult circumstances. Grandma Moses was born Anna Marie Robertson on September 7, 1860, in Greenwich, New York. She is known for her pastoral landscapes that became a symbol of a simpler time. Raised on a farm in upstate New York, she spent her youth working as a domestic hire, helping her family and nearby neighbors with cleaning, cooking, and sewing. As a child, her father encouraged her to draw on discarded newsprint using natural dyes made from berry and grape juices. Although she didn't actively pursue art or painting for many decades, her experiences growing up and working in a farming community left a lasting impact. The scenes she painted were deeply rooted in the world she knew, showing us that her lived experiences, not formal training, were what truly shaped her art. When she was 27 years old, Moses married and moved to a farm in Virginia, where she raised 5 children. Though she always wanted to paint, she once said, "I just didn't have time until I was 76. And so it was then, when arthritis made it difficult to continue her needlework, that her friends suggested she try painting instead. She used house paint, leftover canvas, and fireboard for her paintings, and she improvised with matches and pins to paint details like eyes and mouths. Despite the hardship that came with a farm, like long hours of physical labor, unpredictable weather, and the financial instability, she painted joyful memories of fields, storms, barn dances, and holidays in rural New York and Virginia. Her paintings were sold at county fairs alongside her prize-winning pickles. They were nostalgic scenes of American life. Take Sugaring Off, for example. We see a community engaged in the time-honored tradition of turning sap into maple syrup. Moses always painted in a step-by-step manner, working top-down, so let's look at it as such. The sky is a pale blue-gray, suggesting a cold day, yet it doesn't feel harsh or foreboding. Rather, it complements the overall calmness of the snowy environment. Looking down, we see a gentle, rolling landscape covered in snow. Bare trees, typical of late winter, are painted in soft grays and browns, with snow resting on their branches, a touch of serenity that floats above the activity below. Barns and cabins are painted in browns and grays. Smoke rising from the chimneys adds to the sense of warmth amidst the surrounding cold. The focal point of the painting is the people, dressed in earthly tones, browns, reds, and greens, that contrast against the white of the snow. The expressions and postures of the figures suggest a sense of purpose and cooperation, as everyone plays a role in this labor-intensive task. The flat perspective and the understated style make it feel like a memory, maybe one that's a bit idealized, but still rooted in reality. It's a modest scene, yet it's deeply human. She is showing us what it means to belong, to take part in something larger than oneself, a tradition, a season, or a community. In 1939, her work finally caught the attention of a collector who purchased all of her paintings that were displayed in a local pharmacy window. At the time, she was known simply as Mrs. Moses, but a 1940 review in the New York Herald Tribune mentioned that her neighbors fondly called her Grandma Moses, a nickname that stuck and became a part of her identity. As her reputation grew, so did her influence. By 1947, Hallmark had sold 16 million greeting cards featuring her artwork, making her a household name. 5 years later, at the age of 92, she published her autobiography, My Life's History. In it, she expressed her feelings about the limitations placed on her because of her gender. She wrote, "Many a time I had to rock the cradle. I liked it, but I had rather been outdoors with my brothers." By the time of her death at 101, Moses had produced around 2,000 paintings, solidifying her as a significant figure in American folk art. In looking back at the artistic legacies of Clementine Hunter and Grandma Moses, I am struck by the fascinating convergence and divergence in their work. Both of these self-taught artists began their painting careers later in life, and though their artistic journeys overlapped in the 1940s and 50s, their lives and their works are noticeably different. Hunter's work gives us a raw, intimate look at life for Black Americans in Louisiana, while Moses depicted the peaceful, nostalgic scenes of rural white America in upstate New York. Art is often a reflection of the artist's environment, experiences, and perspective. And these two remarkable women, through their uniquely separate lives, beautifully captured the two sides of America in the 1900s. Bill Traylor occupies a unique position in the history of American art as one of the very few artists whose work bridges a tumultuous transition period between slavery and civil rights. Born into slavery in 1853 on a plantation in Dallas County, Alabama, Traylor lived through the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. Though freedom was granted to him at the age of 10, the post-war Reconstruction period, which aimed to integrate formerly enslaved people into society, was short-lived. Southern states quickly enacted Jim Crow laws, a collection of state and local laws that legalized racial segregation. So although legally emancipated, Traylor's life remained controlled by the oppressive systems of the South. He stayed on the same plantation where he had been enslaved, working as a sharecropper for the next 45 years. Sharecropping, in theory, was intended to be a way for freed slaves to work their own land in exchange for living accommodations and a share of the profit from the sale of the crop at the end of the harvest. However, the landowners controlled everything, the land and the tools, and often charged high interest rates on any loans for supplies. As a result, the system often trapped sharecroppers in a cycle of debt and poverty, unable to leave the land because they owed more money than they earned from their crops. In 1928, following the death of his wife and the migration of his children to the North and West, Traylor, then in his mid-70s, moved to Montgomery, Alabama. He explained this decision by stating, "My white folks had died and my children had scattered." He rented a small room and later moved into a shack, doing whatever work he could to survive. When rheumatism forced him to stop working in a shoe factory, Traylor relied on public assistance and lived on the streets. During this challenging time, he began to draw, using scraps of cardboard and any materials he could find. And between 1939 and 1942, he produced nearly 1,500 pieces of art while sitting on the sidewalks of Montgomery. His work is characterized by a profound simplicity that cloaks its complexity. He frequently started with basic geometric forms like triangles, rectangles, and semicircles, which he would then shade with pencil or fill with paint. These shapes became people, animals, buildings, and more. Take his painting House, for example. We see a house that's almost childlike in its depiction. A rectangular structure with a peaked roof drawn with bold, unrefined lines. It's a minimalist version of a building that's almost floating in isolation. We can see 5 figures in and on top of the house, stripped down in their form but with exaggerated proportions. There's a figure painted in blue atop the roof, holding what looks like a rope attached to the figure next to him. They're standing on a pole or plank of some sort, which a third figure depicted horizontally is holding onto. They have one of their arms holding onto the pole, while the rest of their body is suspended precariously in the air. The figure on the left has a rope in hand as well that's hanging off of the central figure's head. Inside the house, visible through an opening, we see a 5th figure, perhaps bearded, suggesting an older man. Below the house, there's an animal with an elongated body and prominent ears, adding a whimsical touch to the scene, though its true meaning remains ambiguous. In June of 1939, Charles Shannon, a young white artist from Montgomery, noticed Traylor working on the streets and became intrigued by his talent. Shannon began to visit Traylor regularly, providing him with art supplies and eventually organizing an exhibition of Traylor's work. The exhibit, titled Bill Traylor, People's Artist, opened in February of 1940 at the New South Cultural Center, which Shannon had found. It featured 100 of Traylor's drawings and received numerous reviews in local newspapers. Unfortunately, none of the works were sold, but this exhibit was the only one Traylor lived to see. Today, he is celebrated for his modernist works that express a universe of emotions into simple shapes. His art is neither straightforward memory painting nor realistic depictions, but rather a curation. He chooses his compositions with intention and omits everything else. His body of work is singular in the history of art. His oeuvre stands alone, a rare surviving testament from a man who endured the brutalities of American slavery, yet found a way to transform it into something quietly profound and enduring. John Kane's journey from the mines of West Calder, Scotland, to the art galleries of America is a kind of improbable narrative that lends itself to myth, but his life was far from easy. He was born in 1860 to Irish parents who had migrated to Scotland in search of better opportunities. His earliest memory of art came with a sharp sting, being reprimanded by a schoolmaster for drawing when he should have been paying attention. By the age of 9, at his own request, he began working in the mines to help support his family, attending schools in the evening whenever he could. But eventually, when the death of his father and the demands of supporting his mother and 6 siblings became too much, he quit school to work full-time. When he was 19 years old, he made the decision to leave Scotland and follow his brother and stepfather to Pennsylvania. They traveled from city to city along the East Coast, taking on various jobs as coal miners, steel workers, and road pavers. The changing landscapes and the people he encountered along the way eventually became the subjects of his artwork. On a night in 1891, his life was violently altered in a railroad yard when he was hit by an unlit train while trying to push his cousin to safety. His left leg was severed at about 5 inches below his knee. This limited him in being hired as a laborer, but it didn't stop him in taking charge of his new circumstances. He made his own wooden leg and took a job as a crossing watchman at the very railroad where he had been injured. He worked in this role for 8 years, finally leaving to be a painter of steel railroad cars at the Pressed Steel Car Company in McKees Rocks, Pennsylvania. Here he spent his lunch hours sketching landscapes on the sides of railroad cars, only to watch them be covered by solid colored paint once his break was over. During this time, he married and had 2 daughters. Their 3rd child, a son named John, died just 2 days after birth, a loss that deeply affected Kane. Grief-stricken, he turned to alcohol, which eventually led to the breakdown of his marriage and family. With his wife and daughters gone, Kane was left to live in a flophouse operated by the Salvation Army, destitute and alone. To support himself, he went door to door in mining settlements, offering to paint portraits by enlarging photographs and adding color. This side work, along with his experiences painting railroad cars, built a foundation that would later support his more serious pursuits in art. Unlike formally trained artists, Kane taught himself through observation and practice, often describing his process as puzzling and figuring out how a painting should look. His work demonstrates an astute understanding of the landscapes and the figures he depicted, grounded in a personal connection to his experiences. One of Kane's most significant works is his 1929 self-portrait, John Kane in the Looking Glass. This piece is a raw and unflinching portrayal of the artist, who was 69 years old at the time. The act of painting oneself in a mirror is a technique historically associated with artists exploring the nature of self-perception and artistic identity, and Kane is no exception. His naive style, however, takes us a bit further. It shows a bare-chested Kane with his muscular torso and weathered face rendered in exacting detail. His furrowed brow and slightly downturned mouth shows a man marked by hardship, yet unwavering in his resolve. His direct gaze into the mirror, and thus at the viewer, suggests a confrontation with both his past and his present self. The arches above his head in the painting were inspired by the decorative elements of his wife's vanity, where he studied his reflection while creating the portrait. The somber, muted palette contributes to the overall atmosphere of quiet contemplation. Romanticized elements, often found in other artists' self-depictions, don't exist here. He didn't paint this piece with the intention to portray himself in an idealized way, but rather exactly as he was. What we see here is a man accepting that he has lived a difficult but genuine life, without embellishment, but certainly with a sense of dignity. Kane's work remained largely unrecognized until 1927, when after 2 unsuccessful submissions, his work was finally accepted into the Carnegie International Exhibition. This made him the very first self-taught American painter of the 20th century to be recognized by a museum, but his inclusion in the exhibition was not without controversy. The art establishment, in its habitual sneer, questioned whether a man without formal training had any business being there next to real art. But despite their privileged condescension, this moment established Kane as a legitimate figure in the American art scene. And following this, his work was exhibited at prestigious institutions, such as the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., and the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. His work even reached international audiences when in 1938, MoMA featured Kane in the Masters of Popular Painting exhibition, which traveled to the Jeux de Paume Museum in Paris. Kane's contributions to American art are significant not only because of his individual achievements, but also because of the broader implications of his work for the recognition of self-taught artists. His ability to translate the experiences of working-class life into compelling visual narratives has opened the door for future generations of artists who, like Kane, operate outside the traditional structures of art education and profession. Martin Ramirez was born in 1895 in Jalisco, Mexico, a rural farming village. By the 1920s, as the country struggled with the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution and severe economic instability, he, like many others, emigrated to the United States in search of better opportunities. He left behind his wife and 4 children in Mexico, and unable to speak English, he found work on railroads and in the mines of California. But his timing couldn't have been worse. The Great Depression hollowed out those few opportunities, and by 1931, Ramirez was adrift, unhoused, and in a state of distress. He was arrested for unclear reasons and subjected to a psychiatric evaluation. After being diagnosed with catatonic schizophrenia, he was committed to 2 state hospitals in California, first in Stockton and then in DeWitt. During his institutionalization, he was mostly nonverbal but was described to have a gentle demeanor. It was here that he began to create his body of artwork, over 300 large-scale mixed-media drawings. His works are characterized by rhythmic compositions, featuring straight and curved hatchings that create space. His subjects often include trains, religious figures, and other elements from his past and Catholic upbringing. And similar to our other self-taught artists, he used whatever materials he could find: scraps of paper, cardboard, melted crayons, charcoal from burnt matches, and homemade glue from bread and potatoes. In Train and Tunnel from the year 1950, we can see Ramirez's artistic style and the deeper autobiographical significance it carries. The train, positioned at the bottom center, features a red front and soft yellow and green windows. It is moving along tracks beneath an arched structure. Trains in particular were a recurring symbol in his body of work, possibly tied to his experiences as a migrant railroad laborer. The tunnel's repetitive lines form a rhythmic pattern, emphasizing both the train's movement and the depth of the space. Using simple materials like paper, pencil, and crayon, he creates a swirling landscape that captures the movement of the tunnel. It's easy to read the tunnel as a metaphor for isolation and confinement, both physical and mental. As a man institutionalized in psychiatric hospitals, Ramirez lived within literal walls, and diagnosed with schizophrenia, he was also walled off in his mind, trapped in a condition that defined him to the outside world, but as this work suggests, did not define his inner vision. His work remained largely unrecognized until Dr. Tarmo Pasto, a psychology professor at DeWitt with an interest in art, discovered his drawings in the 1950s. He found his work remarkable and made sure he had a dedicated workspace and the art supplies he needed. He even helped to have Ramirez's work exhibited at the De Young Museum in San Francisco. However, despite these efforts, Ramirez's art did not gain widespread recognition until a decade after he passed away from tuberculosis. A solo exhibition in 1973, organized by Chicago imagists Gladys Nielsen and Jim Nutt, known for their surreal figurative art, brought Martin Ramirez a wider audience. His oeuvre reflects themes of poverty, alienation, immigration, confinement, and memory. heavy topics to be packed into deceptively simple, swirling lines. His drawings were his personal escape, a world he built through his art that feel more lived in than the reality surrounding him. While he is often compared to other outsider artists like Adolphe Wolfley and Augustin Lesage, Ramirez's style is more resolved and emotionally concentrated. He focused less on his traumatic experiences and more on creating self-contained worlds, and this emotional clarity is what sets him apart. Horace Pippin was a self-taught Black American artist known for his deeply expressive works. He often depicted Black American life, historical events, his experiences as a soldier during World War I, and biblical scenes. He was born in Westchester, Pennsylvania in 1888, and later moved to Goshen, New York with his family. Pippin began to draw at an early age, and even won a box of crayons in an art contest sponsored by an art supplier in 1898. This small but meaningful prize gave him early encouragement in his artistic journey. After finishing the 8th grade, Pippin and his family moved again, and this time to New Jersey. For the next 15 years, he worked as a hotel porter, a storage company mover, and an iron molder. In 1917, Pippin joined the 15th Regiment of the New York National Guard, an all-black unit that was later deployed to France for active combat duty. Only 1 year in, Pippin was shot in the shoulder by a sniper, permanently disabling his right arm. After returning to the United States, he received an honorable discharge and a disability pension, and moved back to Westchester with his new wife. For the most part, they lived off of his military pension and his wife's income from her laundry business. But unable to perform manual labor, Pippin had to take on various odd jobs to help make ends meet, including painting cigar boxes. He completed his first oil painting in 1928, and over the next decade, produced 1 to 4 paintings a year. Excited by his newfound sense of purpose, he expanded to other mediums beyond cigar boxes, and finished his first painting on canvas in 1930. In the early years, Pippin's work was confined to the small audience of those immediately around him. But close to the end of the decade, his paintings had gained him national attention. His ascent in many ways mirrored the folk art revival of the 1930s, a movement that seemed to embrace his raw, unpolished approach. Without formal training, Pippin painted in a non-academic linear style. His compositions were imbued with a sharp sense of design and a bold use of color that distinguished him from his more traditional peers. One of his most recognizable pieces, Holy Mountain 1 from 1944, is an imaginative scene that was inspired by a biblical passage. This was the first painting in a series of 4 that he created between 1944 and 1946, during the final years of World War II. Inspired by an Old Testament passage, the series depicts the peaceful kingdom that is prophesied in the book of Isaiah and epitomizes the artist's spiritual temperament. Growing up in an African Methodist Episcopal church, Pippin's exposure to religious art was likely limited to mass-produced chromolithographs, which were commonly used to illustrate Bibles. This piece resembles the works of the Quaker minister and artist Edward Hicks that was produced a century prior. Hicks interprets the messianic prophecy in the book of Isaiah literally, envisioning an Eden where all creatures live in perfect harmony, while Pippin adjusts the composition to reflect his personal experiences and the cultural climate of the time. A shepherd of African ancestry, dressed in a bright white robe, stands at the center of the canvas. He is surrounded by a group of children and animals amongst a lush landscape. Our main subject bears a striking resemblance to the artist himself, and in fact, many scholars consider it to be a self-portrait. The harmony that lives in the foreground is balanced with a threatening and ominous background. We can see soldiers lurking in the forest that is adjacent to a military burial ground. The date that this piece was signed, June 6, 1944, corresponds with D-Day. a turning point in World War II when the Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy. This detail reinforces the dichotomy between war and peace. About this painting, Pippin has said, "Holy Mountain came to my mind because the whole world is in such trouble. And in reading the Bible, it says that there will be peace in the land. If a man knows nothing but hard times, he will paint them, for he must be true to himself. But even that man may have a dream, an ideal, and Holy Mountain is my answer to such painting." In 1937, Pippin's career started to gain momentum after he submitted 2 of his paintings to a local exhibition at the Chester County Art Association. Christian Brinton, an art critic who co-founded the association, saw something special in Pippin's work. He showed it to the well-known artist N.C. Wyeth, and together they quickly arranged a solo exhibition at the Westchester Community Center. This set up a chain of introductions to curators, dealers, and collectors that soon propelled Pippin's work into the halls of MoMA and the Barnes Foundation. Over his career, he created around 140 pieces, which is a relatively small collection. Through his art, he conveyed the brutal realities of war from his personal experiences, provided a candid depiction of the poverty faced by Black Americans, and portrayed scenes of everyday life that were worth admiring. And he did so while developing a voice and style that stood apart. He described his process saying, "Pictures just come to my mind, and I tell my heart to go ahead." To stand before the works of these 10 artists is to be reminded that art, at its core, is as much about survival as it is about expression. Each piece confronts us with a disarming intimacy, exposing the limitations of the polished institutional narratives that too often define artistic value. The vitality of these outsider artists, whether Rousseau's imagined jungles or Hunter's rural South, forces us to sit with the fact that genius doesn't need permission to exist. It simply does, with or without validation. In their works, we don't find art history's neat progression of styles or movements, but instead a messy, vibrant, utterly human cry for creation. And it is this unruly brilliance that secures their place not on the outskirts, but at the heart of what art truly is.